Are we connected? Perfect. Right now, are we live on Facebook? Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to our Investing 101 series. If this is your first time tuning into our session, my name is Kelly, and pitchIN is Malaysia's leading equity crowdfunding platform, also a registered market operator, also known as RMO, with the Securities Commission of Malaysia. pitchIN Equity has successfully helped startups collectively raise more than 200 million ringgit to date, the most among all ECF platforms in Malaysia. Equity crowdfunding gives investors the opportunity to invest in fast-growing companies that have potentials for growth, where the public, such as retail investors, can invest alongside with angel and sophisticated investors. For more information and to find out how you can invest, head over to www.equity.pitchin.my. At pitchIN, we regularly run these webinars for both investors and businesses who are looking to raise funds. If this is something of your interest, don't forget to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/pitchin.my so we can keep you regularly updated on all our programs. If you're currently tuned into Zoom, you can use this chat button to chat with the audience, and please use the Q&A button for all questions. If you're currently tuned in via Facebook and would like to join us on Zoom, we have pasted the Zoom link of the webinar in the comment section. If you choose to stay on Facebook, you can paste all your questions at the comment section and we will answer all of them accordingly. Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Let's see who's out there. Hi. Hi, everyone. How's everyone feeling today? Comment on the chat box and let me know how you're feeling. All right. Let me see. So today, we have a very, very special guest. We have, just give me a minute. Facebook. Today we have David from DNP Partners, I believe. Hold up, just give me a minute. Sorry, I lost my deck. All right, I'm back. Sorry. So today with me, we have David. David is the partner of the corporate commercial team at DNP Law Group. Prior to joining DNP Law Group, David was part of the corporate M&A team of a leading Malaysian law firm, ranked as Tier 1 by Legal 500 and ASEAN Legal Business in Malaysia. David regularly advises domestic and international clients on merger and acquisition transactions involving companies in industries such as aviation, insurance, construction, online marketplace platforms, commodities, and oil and gas. He actively engaged on advising startups and SMEs in Malaysia on their investment exercise, as well as any M&A activities, by leveraging on his experience to provide simple and accessible legal advice and negotiation know-how to the stakeholders. All right, so today's format will be a 40-minute session where David will be sharing his knowledge on the topic of the different types of business entities and shares in Malaysia, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. So if you have any question, feel free to drop at the Q&A button and we will answer all of them accordingly. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome David. Hi, David. Welcome to our Investing 101 series, and thank you so much for being here today.
No problem. Thanks a lot, Kelly, for
the floor is yours.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is David. I'm a partner at DNP Law Group. We are a boutique law firm based in Mont Kiara. So prior to this, I was working in quite a large law firm in Malaysia, and my sort of specialization is on mergers and acquisition. And I regularly advise my clients on any purchase of shares, any investment exercise, whether it's for equity or for convertible note, and sometimes for sales of business as well. Today, I'd like to share with all of you on the different type of business entities that you can find in Malaysia, and also some of the common misconceptions about them, and also to just give some insights on why you would choose one entity over the other. Lastly, I would also talk about shares in these companies, namely ordinary shares and preference shares, and sort of outline the differences between the two. Without further ado, I would share my screen. Hold on a minute. If anyone can't see my screen or at any point, or if there's a connection issue, please let us know.
I think this slide is the presenter slide and not the viewer slide.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Hold on. Let me switch around. And right. Does it work now, Kelly?
Perfect.
Right. Hi. So let me just skip through my introduction. So as I mentioned earlier, we're a boutique law firm based in Mont Kiara. We assist with both corporate transactions and litigation as well. Myself, I'm the partner of the corporate team. So we advise individuals and companies on their investment exercise and M&A transactions. Some of my key experience would be advising Carousel Singapore as the Malaysian counsel on its acquisition of 701 Search Private Limited. The name may not be familiar, but this is actually the holding company of Mudah.com platform in Malaysia. So Carousel actually owns Mudah.com now. And also I advise a Korean private equity firm or as the local Malaysian counsel as well on its investment in SOCA Malaysia. More recently, we've also advised a couple of individuals on the disposal of their shares in the company sort of through their shareholders agreement. And also we have a client who's going through their Series A investment exercise, and we are advising them on the same as well. So without further ado, let's start on the type of business entities you would find in Malaysia. I think we are quite familiar with the idea of a sole proprietorship, meaning if you want to open a business, you would go to the Companies Commission of Malaysia, and you would register a business with them under your own name, right? But in general, for us as corporate lawyers, once the individual or the owner is ready to transition, there are different types of business entities that we would tend to advise them to go for, right? And today I'll be going through a few of them just to give you a flavor of what these entities are. So the first one would be company limited by shares. The idea of a company limited by shares is really that the liability of the company is limited by its shares. So if the company has 1,000 shares of one ringgit each, so technically the capital of the company would be 1,000 ringgit. And as the shareholder, your sort of buy-in or your liability is only limited by the number of shares you own. So if let's just say the company owes 10,000 ringgit, but the company only has a 1,000 ringgit capital, does that mean that you are on the hook for the 10,000 ringgit? Actually, no. I mean, if the liability is higher than the capital, then it just means the company owes the money and the company probably needs to wind up because it couldn't pay back its debtor. So that's a sort of idea of what a company limited by shares is. And there are two types of company limited by shares. One being private company, which we are very familiar with, Sendirian Berhad. We see Sendirian Berhad almost everywhere we go. It's the most common type of entity in Malaysia. Mostly SMEs, startups, they do start with Sendirian Berhad because you can allocate shares to your shareholders and you can appoint directors and sort of more of a familiarity thing, right? And once a Sendirian Berhad is sort of ready to go take the next step, so per se, they would normally go for a conversion into a public company, also known as Berhad. Today, we are very familiar with the idea of a Berhad because we are looking at the stock exchange, the Bursa Stock Exchange. So here, to correct a misconception, not all public companies are listed on the stock exchange, right? There are, in order to be listed on the stock exchange, there are certain requirements to be fulfilled. But at the same time, a private company is able to convert itself to a public company should it wishes to do so. But I will talk a little bit more about why we don't see that happening in sort of the commonly asked question part, right? So a public company, they don't have any limit on the number of shareholders. Technically, you can have 1,000 shareholders, 10,000 shareholders, that's fine. So it has access to the public equity, it can offer shares to the public at large, and it can also issue bonds, it can also issue warrants, and they can, as I mentioned, they can be listed or unlisted. A third type of company that we sometimes see is a company limited by guarantee, right? A company limited by guarantee, technically there are no shares involved. It's limited by the fact that it's established for a particular purpose. For example, it could be charity, scientific, and etc., etc. Normally, we see this entity being used for like a yayasan, and you do need to get the minister's approval from the domestic trade minister. So you need to get an approval before you can open a company limited by guarantee. But we don't see this being used a lot for commercial reasons, because number one, you can't do so, it must be for social purpose. So, but just something to keep in mind for completeness, that there's also a third type, which is a public company, which is limited by guarantee. So when we see a Berhad, sometimes they could be a company limited by guarantee, or they could just be a sort of normal public company.
David, we have a question from the floor. Let me just go back to the first page. Yeah, so the question is by Rachel, and she's asking, what is the legal and structural differences between Sandera Berhad and Berhad? And now that SC has allowed Berhad company to raise funds via equity crowdfunding, what does it mean for retail investor like her in terms of valuation and risk?
Okay, maybe I'll go to what's the sort of differences first, right? So a private company, by law, your maximum number of shareholders is 50 shareholders, right? And the minimum number of shareholders you can have is 1 shareholder and 1 director. Whereas a public company, you don't have any limit on the number of shareholders, which means if you're looking at equity crowdfunding sort of model, technically a public company can go out there and get as many shareholders as they want, right? Which also means that they have access to a larger pool of funds as compared to a private company, which is normally sort of restricted by the number of shareholders that you can have. Also, just to highlight a few other differences. For private company, you don't need to have a general meeting, an annual general meeting. For a public company, you need to have an annual general meeting every year, and the minimum number of directors is 2 directors. For a private company, you need to audit your accounts, but you don't need to present the accounts at a general meeting and get it sort of approved and sort of presented to your shareholders, so per se. So your accounts are sort of private in a way. Although that being said, if the public wants to do a search on your company, they can extract your audited financial statement. In terms of risk and valuation, I can't say that like I am the subject matter expert, to be honest. That would still largely depend on the revenue of the company, the capital of the company, right? There are different valuation methods out there, right? Like DCF and all that stuff. So unfortunately, I can't talk about the risk and valuation from of sort of the differences in the risk and valuation between the two. But I would think that it largely depends on the company itself and sort of the financial figures of the company still.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Yeah, sure. So let me just move to the next slide. We also wanted to talk about limited liability partnership because it tends to be brought up quite a lot in our conversation with clients as to why can't we go for LLP, right? So if you see any company, any entity out there or business out there where it has the word PLP at the end, right? This means that it's a limited liability partnership. So what is the difference between a liability partnership and a conventional partnership where you and your partner probably form a business together and register a business together. The salient features is this: if you have a limited liability partnership, it is considered a separate legal entity from its partners. So if let's say that there is any liability, or let's just say that if the limited liability partnership closes down and sort of liquidates, the partners are not sort of personally liable for it. And then the governance of your limited liability partnership is governed by a partnership agreement. And a limited liability partnership has its own capacity to sue and be sued by others, and also can own properties in its own name. I think this is a point that I also wanted to sort of zoom in a little bit. So having your own capacity to sue and be sued by others is a rather important one, because if you think about it, if we are talking about conventional partnership, if the partnership wants to sue a supplier, for example, for not supplying the stocks, every single one of the partners technically has to be named in that lawsuit, and every single partner needs to sort of agree to it and sue the supplier. From a practical point of view, that is actually quite cumbersome, because you can't imagine, like, let's say you have 5 partners and you need all 5 partners to sort of be personally involved in the lawsuit. And if you have like partners who are not taking an active role, they may not be too happy about that, right? And for LLP, the changes in the partners will not affect the existence, the rights or liabilities of LLP. So pretty much what I've said above, it exists on its own. So let's just say that if the LLP constantly has to change in partner, the LLP can still exist unless the partners all decide collectively to sort of close down, to wind up or liquidate it, right? And for LLP, you have no requirement to convene a general meeting, and you don't need to audit your financial statement. From a compliance point of view, from a cost point of view as well, this is something that business owners have in mind, right? That you don't have to spend like another 3,000 or 4,000 ringgit a year just to audit your account. You don't need to keep the service of a company secretary. You only need a compliance officer, which can be any of the partner, right? That being said, LLP is something that was introduced in 2012 with a lot of sort of hope and excitement, but it hasn't really taken off as much as we thought it would. And I think there's a few reasons for that. Number one being that it was mainly targeted towards professional services, so like lawyers, accountants, auditors. However, I think like Malaysian Bar, I think all the governing body of professional services haven't really recognized it. So you technically can't be a LLP if you're a law firm, right? And I won't go too much detail of what it is, but like basically professional services have not adopted LLP or unable to adopt LLP. Secondly, we'll come to it in a bit, but also because of the limitation in terms of how you can induct new investor and new partners. LLP, unlike a company, it doesn't issue shares, right? So you can't just have issuance of shares by the LLP to a partner. You actually need to induct the partner and get them to be a party to the agreement.
David, we have one question that's related to LLP. Allow me to ask that question. It's by Erwan. So Erwan is asking, is LLP also a limited liability company? And is this completely different from Sdn Bhd or Berhad company? Under a limited liability company, are shareholders insulated from liabilities? Debts means only the company will bear liabilities?
Yep, the short answer is yes, except I wouldn't use I'm sorry, I think my slide has the word company in there. I'm really trying to avoid using the word company, but yes, in essence, I would say it's similar where you are insulated, right? The partners, in this case, not the shareholders, are insulated for any liabilities from the LLP, right? Of course, that is purely from a business point of view. I mean, legally, if there's any offense under the law, I must caveat that part, right? That is separate. But yes, similar to Sendirian Berhad, separate legal entity, liability is limited.
Thank you, David. There's another question that I would like to ask from the floor by Alex Ho. Is there any restriction for a Berhad company as to fundraising from the public? Can the issuer, which is company that's raising fund, just pitch for funding from a group of investor on their own without going through an ECF platform or investment banker?
So this depends on whether listed or unlisted. Of course, if you're a listed company, it's quite straightforward. If you're a listed company, your issuance of shares and everything really has to go through Bursa Malaysia, right? So I think, Alex, for your question, I would answer it from a point of view of unlisted public company. Can you go to the public and just issue shares to anyone? Short answer is yes, but there are certain requirements as to how you do it, right? So normally, in the case of you pitching to investors, you would need to issue what we call an information memorandum or pitch deck. The rule now from the guideline from ST is that you don't have to file that particular document with SC, but you need to put certain disclaimers into that document, which is in the guideline itself, right? If you're looking at a specific group of investor as well, right? It's quite factual in nature. So if you ask, if we are advising our clients, we would say, if you already identified the group of investor, then don't make it public in the sense where go directly to that group of people and then call it a private placement, right? Means you as the company go to investor A directly. But if you put it on your website and say, hey, anyone out there wants to invest in a company, click on this link, register your interest, that is sort of going to the public. It's very much factual, like we have to look at the whole situation. But I think the short answer is yes, but the manner on how you do it, it's very important. I think that answers quite a complicated and layered question, but happy to discuss further. And just to chime in a little bit, of course, going to equity crowdfunding platform is something that is recognized legally, right? So I would say that, like, it's not that you have to choose one or the other, but you can take a lot of comfort if you are doing your equity crowdfunding through a recognized market operator such as pitchIN, right?
Mm-hmm. So guys, at the end of this session, David will actually share his contact. So if you have any deeper question or any further question, please feel free to reach out to him. David, we have one more question about LLP, and I'm gonna. It's kind of complex, but maybe I think it's best that we take this question now. So one of the questions from the attendee: what other limitation are there that is not talked about? I was told you must have a second shareholder, and SSM only allows LLP to register for a maximum of 3 business codes. Sendirian Berhad has a maximum of 10 business codes.
Okay, interesting point. Yes, it is true. You need to have, again, I must correct that, a minimum of 2 partners, right? And I think that is kind of a funny point which get asked as well. But how can we call it a partnership if there are no partners, right? So hence why for a limited liability partnership, you need 2 partners to form the partnership. So yeah, so that's the number 1 answer. And on the business code, I do understand that you can only choose 3 business codes. And I think that is more administrative rather than like you're not bound by the business code you choose. Don't quote me on this. That companies change their business nature all the time, right? And even if you choose 10 business codes at the start, you may end up doing a different business and you may update it at a later stage, right? So I wouldn't worry too much about the limitation in choosing business codes, rather that you can always amend it at a later stage. And I've not come across any instances where TCM came after a company where it's like, hey, you're doing a business that is not according to your business code. We're gonna, fine you for it. That tends not to be the case. I don't think they have time. There's so many companies out there that are probably not doing business according to their business code. But again, it's not an official statement, more of a practical one.
All right, thank you, David.
Yep. Okay.
Move it.
So sort of just the next slide.
Sorry, we just have one more that came in about LLP. Would you mind if I take it? All right.
No
so
problem.
for LLP, what happens if in the event my partner becomes a bankrupt a while after our LLP company is registered?
So this is where the partnership agreement actually comes in quite important. Of course, if your partnership agreement provides that if any of the partner becomes bankrupt, they need to basically be removed as a partner and replaced immediately. Then you have a mechanism on how that would happen. But even if there's none, sort of from a practical point of view, I haven't really squared in on the provisions of the LLP Act, but I would imagine that there's a section that mentions about bankruptcy of a partner. And if there's a bankruptcy or death of a partner, the natural thing is that the LLP would look for a new partner to take his or her place, sorry. And in the event you're not able to do so, naturally the LLP will be sort of terminated, the partnership will be terminated, and you can revert to a sole proprietorship if you want to. I would say that's how you would do it, or you could then incorporate a Sendirian Berhad and then run it on your own. But the first point of call would be to replace the partner. And it should be something that's in your partnership agreement, but it's also something that's provided for in the LLP Act. If you want further advice on this, I think, yeah, it's something you can inquire. And then there's a specific section. I just can't recall it at the top of my head.
All right, thank you, David.
Okay, just to go on sort of to summarize everything, right? So what are we did like a comparison of the salient features of the 3 business entities that we're talking about, right? So for private limited company, the instrument for investment, when we talk about equity, right, is normally shares, and it could be ordinary shares or preference shares. For public company, you can issue shares, and you can also issue warrants. Warrants is a right to subscribe for shares in the future at a certain predetermined price. And for LLP, reason why I put question mark is because there's no specific instrument, right? The LP can't issue shares. The LP may be able to issue some kind of credit note, but we've not seen that. So in other words, if you are investing in the LLP, you are technically contributing your capital directly into the LLP as a partner, and that must be reflected in the partnership agreement. If it's not, then it may not even be reflected anywhere in the sort of SSM documents, and that is probably why, right? Coming back to the question that I said earlier, LLP is not such a popular vehicle or entity that people use for purposes of investment, because eventually you will hit this roadblock when you're trying to scale or you're trying to receive investment, where you're unable to sort of issue instrument for investment, and you're always relying on the addition of new partners into the picture. And yeah, so that's sort of one of the difficulty that we foresee with LLP as the business grow. Another thing as well is just to highlight that private limited company, there's a maximum of 50 shareholders. A public company, there's no limit. LLP, there's technically no limit to partners. You can keep adding partners, but of course, from a practical point of view, if you have LLP with 100 partners, it's going to be a real havoc to have that many partners trying to govern the company at once, right? In terms of disclosure of financial statements, I think this is something that investors would be very concerned about, because you would want to be able to see the accounts, the audited accounts every year. You want to know what's happening with the company. So again, why private limited company and public company is probably the preferred vehicle for investor is because there's an audit requirement, and there is also a disclosure element to it. So for private limited company, you don't have to do a public disclosure. You don't have to disclose it publicly during a general meeting, because there's no need to have a general meeting in the first place. But it's still accessible to your shareholder, right? And it's still accessible to public if they make a search to extract it out. Whereas for public company, as you know, you always see AGM, annual report, public disclosure is required for the financial statements, and you need to audit. In terms of LLP, very private, very confidential, no disclosure required, no audit required, and there is no need to file your financial statements with SSM as well. So if you have a business and you want to keep it rather small and private and confidential, LLP is something that people will consider. These are actually the benefits or the advantages, right? In terms of governance document, meaning what do we look at in terms of governance? For private limited company, it's normally the constitution and or the shareholders agreement. So most companies with investors, they tend to have both, because the constitution will reflect the terms of the shareholders agreement. In terms of a public company, it's normally a constitution. Funnily, I got asked before, why is there why are there no shareholders agreement for public company? Purely because it's crazy, or it's not it's not practical to have 1,000 shareholders signing the same shareholders agreement. So public company can't do it. They just can't do it, right? And in terms of LLP, it's a partnership agreement, like I said. And this is really the paramount document for LLP. Everything should be set up in the partnership agreement, all the rights, the obligations of each partner. But from a lawyer's point of view, we tend to see a lot of LLP without partnership agreement, or they have a very simple one, which doesn't really tell you a lot about how the company needs to be governed or run.
All right, David, we have a few questions regarding the shareholder agreement and constitution. So the first one is, what is a constitution? Our co-sec did not run us through the importance of company and constitution when we set up a Sendirian Berhad. The second question is, what is the difference between shareholders agreement and constitution for Sendirian Berhad? Okay,
great question, actually. So maybe a bit of historical, not so historical, but back in 2017, when we have the New Companies Act, the concept of a memorandum and articles of association, right, which is M&A, was removed. And also what was removed was the requirement to have a M&A, or what is now called a constitution. Because of that, I think for cost reason as well, and just to make everybody's life a little bit easier, most company secretaries do not recommend, or they do not push for a company to have a constitution, right? And what is a constitution? I think to put it very simply, it's a set of rules that govern the company. So it governs things such as when you want to transfer your shares, what happens when you have your directors meeting, what's the quorum, how many directors needs to be there, must all directors sign the resolution, for general meeting, how often you need to have it. The list goes on, right? It's quite customary, but it's just like a club, a society or association. It has a constitution on how it should be run. A constitution of a company is the same way. In terms of what's the difference between a constitution and a shareholder agreement, actually the difference is here. A shareholder's agreement is a contract at the end of the day. A shareholder agreement binds the parties to the shareholder agreement. And if you go to court and let's just say someone breached the shareholder agreement, your remedy against the person is a contractual one, meaning you will claim for damages, you may claim for damages for breach of shareholder agreement. But at the same time, if the terms of your shareholder agreement is also set out in the constitution, meaning it's a breach of the constitution and it's also a breach of shareholder agreement, what you will be able to do is that not only are you able to sue that person for a breach of contract and get damages out of it, which is normally monetary compensation, you may also be able to say that the other shareholder or the company has acted outside of the constitution, so it's out of his power, right? And you may want to seek for the court to either what we call rescind, which is like take back the action, or cancel the action, right? So maybe in your constitution or your shareholder agreement, there is a preemptive right, meaning they cannot transfer the shares out to someone else unless they get the approval of the existing shareholder. But the other shareholder did it anyway without your knowledge. So if you have both your constitution and shareholder agreement, you kind of have a double barrel shotgun, or you have two guns pointing at them at the same time, right? So which is why it's important when you have a shareholder agreement for the terms of the shareholder agreement to also be reflected in the constitution, right? And if I'm the investor, I will make sure that the terms of the shareholder agreement is also adopted or reflected, right, in the constitution of the company. So that's really the answer to that question.
Thanks, David. I think I will let you finish the slide first because I think we're running a little bit short in time before we take more Q&A. Yeah.
Sure.
Floor is yours, David.
Yep, no problem. So just want to go through some commonly asked questions. I think we have a few of them just now. So what happens if there are more than 50 investors who want to invest in a private limited company? So that just now we had this question where this sort of restriction, right, where private limited company can only have 50 shareholders. So as the answer is the investor may actually enter into a nominee trust arrangement with a trustee who actually hold the shares on trust for the investor. The trustee will represent the investor collectively in any decision-making process. For example, attending the general meeting, making decisions for the board seat, and also collection of dividend, most importantly. So I think for like equity crowdfunding platform, because the the barrier to entry is lower, where you can actually buy, you can sort of huddle behind the platform or the nominee that is provided by the platform, right, such as pitchIN. You can actually do so, right? There may be 1,000 backers, but they can actually all stand behind one nominee so that it doesn't exceed the 50 investor limit for a private limited company. So how does that look like? I think it's best represented using like a chart. So the issuing company here, sort of the investee, right? They will issue the shares to nominee. I think there's a nominee company by pitchIN called pitchIN Nominee, and pitchIN Nominee will actually hold all the shares, right, on trust for the investors. So there can be like 10,000 investors, and they can all sort of huddle behind the nominee. So why are private limited companies preferred? As private limited companies in general have the flexibility to issue different types of share which carries specific rights. Yeah, so for example, like preference shares where it carries certain like dividend rights. LLPs, you can't really have that because you don't have a specific investment instrument, and it will be considered a direct contribution, right? And each new investor of LLP will need to be a party to the LLP agreement. And it's just really troublesome, right? Because every single time you have a new investor, you need to sign a revised LLP agreement. How easy is it to subscribe for shares? This is also when a private limited company or a company comes in really useful, right? Because the process for subscribing for shares only involves the company and the subscriber. So technically, if I want to subscribe for shares in company A, that agreement only needs to be between me and company A, and it doesn't really need to involve anyone else, right? Whereas if you go in the LLP, you probably need everyone to re-sign the LLP agreement. And once the company or the company secretary file the return of allotment and update the register of members, you technically own the shares and you are effective owner of the shares that are allotted to you. Right, so let me run through the two different types of shares. We hear a lot about ordinary shares as a sort of equity instrument or preference shares, right? So today I just want to talk a little bit about the differences between the two. So ordinary shares gives you ordinary rights, or rather I would say that it's sort of the default rights, right? Such as you get to vote at the general meeting and you get the right to receive any dividend declared. Normally, depending on how the shareholder agrees to it or how it's provided in the shareholder agreement, you may also get a board seat as a result of subscribing for ordinary shares. For preference shares, it gives you preferential rights, which means normally the terms of the preference shares would say that you get priority for any dividend that's declared, or if there is a distribution of asset in the company when it goes through winding up. So essentially, you just have to see it as you get priority to any financial benefit that comes with holding a share. The second part is where there's a bit of misconception. Ordinary shares, you get full voting rights, which means you can vote on any matters relating to the company. So if the company wants to commit a very big amount of capital expenditure and stuff like that, they need to go through the ordinary shareholders as well, right? As well as the board directors. But for preference shares, you have limited voting rights. And what that means is you can't really, if you're a preference shareholder, you can't really attend a general meeting and vote the same way that an ordinary shareholder would vote. You can only vote on matters affecting the rights of a preference shareholder. So for example, if under the agenda there is a resolution to amend the rights of these preference shares, then yes, you get the right to vote on it. Or if the company wants to wind up, and as a result of winding up, it will affect your rights, you can actually vote on it. There's actually a list of what preference shares mean. The list of matters that is provided under the Companies Act, right? But in general, the rule of thumb is that you can only vote on matters affecting the rights of the preference shares. For ordinary shares, you don't need to set out the rights of ordinary shareholders in the Constitution. It's kind of like default. You will get voting rights. You have right to declare dividend if the company declare any. However, for preference shares, in general, the preferential rights, meaning the priority to the dividend, it needs to be set out in the constitution, because, well, it also makes sense to do so because you are trying to get something that is additional and also in priority. So if you don't set it out in the constitution, then it becomes like just there, right? And this is why, again, constitution is important, because if you're looking for investment at some point, and if your investment instrument is a preference share, you would need to have a constitution, and you will need to incorporate the rights of the preference shares into your constitution. The fourth point is quite an interesting one, which is rate of dividend. So when you subscribe for ordinary share, the dividend that you're going to get from each share is not fixed, unless it's a special class of shares that was issued, right? And your dividend is at the discretion of the board. So for example, this year the board makes, like the company makes a good profit. The board may decide that, okay, we'll declare a dividend of 10% on the price of every share, right? So for every 1 ringgit you put in, you get 10 cents on it. The board may feel very generous, right? It's a particularly good year, it will go up to 30%, 40%. And if it's a private limited company where there's just a few shareholders, they may decide to even declare a higher dividend for themselves, right? Provided that the company has the profit and the sort of capital to support it. However, for preference shares, usually the rate of dividend will be specified as part of the rights for the preference shares. So it could be 8%, which is quite a decent rate, right, compared to like your fixed deposit and stuff like that. And I think if you look at all the companies seeking for investment and they are issuing preference shares, you would see that the percentage, the rate of dividend are usually specified, and it will be a rate that is better than, I guess, conventional deposit out there, or probably even slightly better than a conventional loan interest rate. The fifth point is here, not all companies can declare dividend every year. So it depends on whether the company is making money or not. So for ordinary shares, you are typically not entitled to accrue dividends, meaning if the company doesn't declare dividend for that year, then you don't get any dividend. And again, it goes to the next year, and depending on the performance next year and the discretion of the board, you may be able to get dividend from that. Whereas for preference shares, you can actually state in the rights of the preference shares that the dividend can be accrued. So what this means is, let's just say that you have a preference share that has 8% rate of dividend. This year, the company doesn't declare any dividend. That dividend payable to you, although the company is not able to declare it, will be accrued, meaning it will be carried forward to the year after. So assuming the year after the company does pretty well and they are able to pay out dividend, you will be able to demand for that 8% for last year plus the 8% this year to be paid to you. Or you can let it accrue all the way until maturity and then get it all in one shot. So this is really the difference. In terms of redemption of shares, okay, so redemption of shares, just to clarify on this concept, in general, the company, a private company, is not able to redeem its own share. They can cancel the share, but they are not able to redeem. What it means is a company can't buy back its own shares. A private company can't buy back its own shares. A public company is allowed to do so. It's also a sort of unique feature to a public company. But if you issue preference shares, you can actually state that it is a term of the preference shares to be redeemable, so it can be redeemed, right? So we always see the term RPS or RCPS. So the R in the RPS is redeemable. So just to highlight as well, yeah, but the redemption itself is subject to the requirements of Section 72 of Companies Act. I will come to it in the commonly asked question on what the requirements are, but a preference shares as compared to a ordinary share, preference shares can be redeemed, meaning the company may redeem it at the end of maybe 5 years, being the maturity date. They can buy back the shares from the shareholder. So you as an investor, you know that there is sort of an investment horizon to it, and the company wants it, if it can meet the requirement, it will actually be able to buy back the shares. Okay, the last point is convertibility. Ordinary shares are not convertible. It's already at its sort of basic form. So you can't convert the ordinary shares to other type of shares. But you can, typically we do see the conversion right to be included as one of the rights of preference shares, meaning from a preference shares, you're able to perhaps convert it to a ordinary share thereafter. There could be a 1-to-1 conversion ratio, meaning one preference share can be converted into one ordinary share, or it could be one, depending on the negotiation, you could get more ordinary shares from your preference shares as well. And that's normally sort of like the sort of rights that they give you to make it more attractive as an investor, right? Where you actually can hold on to the preference share for the dividends, for all these economic benefits, you get priority. But at the end of the day, when the company probably wants to go for IPO, the company wants to go for a major sale, you get the right to convert your preference shares to ordinary shares and sort of tag along with the sale. So commonly asked questions, when do I choose preference shares over ordinary shares? It really comes down to your purpose for investment. Preference shares are, to play your word, preferred when the control over company is not a priority to the investor, and the investor is more focused on the financial rights, such as the entitlement to the dividend and redemption of shares upon maturity. So in other words, if you are thinking about this like giving out a loan, right, where you give out a principal amount and then you get interest, yearly interest from it, and then at the end of a 5-year period, you want your money back, then preference shares are technically what you would look out for, right? Ordinary shares are preferred when the investors want to have more control over the management of the company, because you want to be able to vote at a general meeting, you want to be able to influence certain decisions in the company. And I think more importantly as well, if you are looking at sort of being quite an active investor and you want to sort of keep everyone on their toes, right, then you will want ordinary shares. Why would an investor request for the dividend rate or preference shares to be fixed? I think I mentioned this earlier. If the dividend rate is fixed, you can sort of ascertain your return on investment for investing in that company, right? And then it's like similar to you giving a loan, whereby you can expect a certain interest rate per annum. This I've explained earlier, so you can accrue dividend for preference shares. Default position for ordinary shareholders would be that every year the declaration of dividends is at the discretion of the board. Preference shares always redeemable. I think I wanted to highlight this point because you may sign an agreement that says that the preference shares and the right to the preference shares or the terms of preference share is that the company will redeem in 5 years. And that sounds good because, like, yeah, I'll get dividend, fixed dividend every year, and then I will get my money back at the end of 5 years, right? But just to highlight, preference shares are not always redeemable. Under the Companies Act, Section 72, redemption of preference shares is subject to the Constitution allowing for redemption, meaning you must have it written in the Constitution, in the terms of Constitution for the preference shares, and it must be redeemed out of the profits of the company, a fresh issue of the shares, or capital of the company. In other words, the risk here is really at the end of the 5 years 5-year period, for example, for maturity, if the company is not doing well at the end of the 5-year period, let's just say they're not making profit, then you have to hold on to your preference shares. The company will not be able to redeem the preference shares, right? If there's no profit. Or the only way out of that situation is that the company issue more shares in order to redeem your shares. But let's just say that the company is not doing well. If it issues more shares, who's gonna subscribe for those shares? Unless the founders come in and subscribe for the shares itself. Or you can sell the preference shares to someone else who's willing to hold on to it, right? And lastly, unless the only other situation out of that is where the company actually has quite a bit of capital, whether it's through shareholder loan or whatever it is, then the company can use that to redeem your shares. But sort of a point to caution that your shares, although it may be provided that it can be redeemed, or it will be redeemed at the 5th year, it's not always the case. It still depends on the performance of the company to a certain extent. With that, that's the end of my slide, Kelly. So I think it's
Hey,
time.
David, we have a lot of questions and I think time is sort of running out. So would you mind if we stay a little longer? Like 10 minutes?
No problem.
All right, let's start. We have a 7-question pending. Let me start with this one, okay? What are ICPS and how is it different from preference shares?
ICPS, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so all these terms are really interesting. So I stands for irredeemable, right? C could be two things. It could be cumulative or convertible, right? So in essence, it's still preference shares, just different types of preference shares. So let's say if you see the word I, it means that the preference shares will not be redeemed. It means it cannot be redeemed by the company. It means that, in other words, the company won't redeem your shares at a maturity date. So that's the irredeemable part. C could stand for convertible, means you can convert your preference shares into ordinary shares at an agreed ratio. Or it could be C for cumulative, which means that you can accumulate the dividend.
Okay. Next one, this is by Alex Ho. What are the requirements in terms of public disclosure of financial statement for an unlisted Berhad company? Where/who/where do I find this? In what form do they need to disclose the financial statement to?
I would say that in general, it's no different from what you will see in a private limited company, right? There's a certain format to it. And I think this is something that you probably have to check with the auditors. There are certain standards on how it should be prepared. How you would disclose it, to be very frank, Alex, I've not seen an unlisted public company's disclosure of its financial statements, because we don't see that a lot in the market, unlisted public company, right? And I would imagine that they would send it directly to the shareholders of the company, because there's not a sort of Bursa website, Bursa announcement, investor relation website for them to upload it to. So I would imagine that they have to email and send it directly to them. But the form of how it's prepared, having seen publicly listed companies' financial statements, and also private companies, it won't be that different.
Okay. Next, following on, is bylaw similar to a constitution?
Yeah, bylaws are American way of calling a constitution, really. We don't use bylaws here, but yeah, it's the same thing in essence.
Okay, a few more. Sorry, there's 4 more questions. Sorry, David. What will be the reason that some investors prefer to have board seats while some do not? And followed by the question is, in a board meeting, a company's motion will be voted based on numbers of votes or numbers of shares?
Okay, so why would you want a board seat?
While some do not? What would the main reason why prefer? Some people prefer ordinary share and some prefer, let's say, preference share. I think that's what he's trying to ask.
Well, I think board seat in general means you get to participate in the sort of decision making of the company, right? You get to sort of set the direction and be very active in decision making. Some investor, they are not active investor. They don't really want to be sitting down with the founders and all the other executive directors, so to say, to deal with the company. So that could be why. And the second part of the question is,
in a board meeting, a company's motion will be voted based on number of votes or number of shares.
In a board meeting, it's normally voted based on it's normally passed by either majority of the director that are present. So it could be majority, let's say there are five directors, so 3 out of 2 that you'll pass. Your shareholding doesn't really matter at a board meeting. It's the number of directors, right? It could be passed by either majority or unanimous. So it depends on what you set it in your constitution and or your shareholder agreement.
Okay, moving on. Can I just incorporate a Berhad company from the get-go, or must I incorporate a Sendirian Berhad first before converting it to a public company?
Sendirian Berhad first and then convert it to a public company. Yeah, I think that also just on that point, you don't go for Berhad straight away because number one, let's just say that you're just starting out, right? You also don't want to bear such a high compliance cost, right, from the start to have a Berhad company, because like I said, the standard for audit for a Berhad company is different, and in general, it's just like most people would like to keep it quite tight knit and private first, and go from there rather than go straight for Berhad. Especially when we just mentioned that in getting investor, you can use a nominee structure, you can use different kind of structures to overcome that maximum number of shareholders, right?
All right, thank you. And one last question. Is it possible for a business to change later on, example, from LLP to Sendirian Berhad?
Yeah, it's possible. SSM does allow for this. You can make an application to convert from sole proprietor to the Sendirian Berhad, and I think whichever way you want to go.
Okay.
Really, yeah, it's possible. It's just that sometimes you might be advised by your company secretary to just create a new one and then just transfer all your thing over rather than do a conversion, because it tends to be a bit more cumbersome and takes time. But I think I'll leave that to the company secretary and accountant to advise you.
All right, David, that will be our last question. Would you like to share your contact with the audience in case they're interested to reach out to you for more inquiry or advice?
Sure. So my mobile number out for the world to see. And also my email is david.lim@dnplawgroup.com. Yeah, in general, feel free to reach out to me by email. I think that would be the most effective means. I do check my email very regularly, so you would be able to contact me. Yeah, and I think for us, we are happy to get a chance to advise both individuals and companies on any legal questions. The idea is that nothing is too complex and too difficult, and we want to simplify everything so that you don't feel afraid to see your lawyers, just like you're no longer afraid to see your dentist, right? Which is a fear of mine for a very long time.
Dentist or the lawyer?
A dentist, right? A dentist
okay.
is my fear for a very long time. But times have changed. Everything has been made so simple and sort of accessible, and people explain it in a way that you can sort of accept very well.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, David. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're interested to rewatch this session today, you can go to our website, our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/pitchintopmy, where you can rewatch this session for today. And if you're interested and you like our session today, don't forget we host Investing 101 series every month. So do stay tuned on our Facebook page to get the latest update. Thank you so much, David. And thank you so much, everyone that participated in this webinar, and hope all of you had a very insightful session. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.